Namaste, hello, and welcome to everyone today for today's special session of Indic Talks. The topic for today is Paddhati, as you can see on your screen. Paddhati, tradition as archive and practice in Indian music. And to speak on this topic, we have with us a very special guest. Her name is Sushruti Santhanam. She is a Carnatic musician and researcher who was trained in the intense Gurukulam of her guru and mother, Sangeeta Kalanidhi Srimati R. Vedavalli. Sushruti ji combines her natural musical talent and wide experience in socio-cultural research to present a composite picture of music within the larger Indian culture. As a musician, she seeks to internalize the quiet essence of Carnatic music and the culture of spiritualism that it carries. As a researcher, she explores the interlinkages between the various musical traditions of India. So, Sushruti is a very rare scholar in this respect that she is both a traditional practitioner and a historian. So she has her academic background, a PhD in history. Am I right?
Yes.
Right. So that's a very rare thing because normally you have academicians or historians who are in their own, separate academic sort of sphere, and then you have practitioners who have a very different world. But it's very rare to find both these worlds come together in one person. And I think, I must congratulate you for, you seem to wear so many hats at the same time, and it's a very rare quality, I think. And we have very few people who have the understanding of tradition. They come from a traditional background, but they're also well versed in the scholarly idiom. So I think that you have that rare quality. So with these words, Sushruti ji, I welcome you and I thank you for coming to our platform.
Thank you for your very generous introduction. Um, Actually, I came to history much later. I started off only as a student of music right from my childhood. So, in that sense, I've trained in a very Gurukula Paddhati. But, since we had to all go through some form of education, I too joined a course in sociology. And then very quickly I realized that there was a large divide, there was a large gaping sort of distance, a chasm between my two streams of education. And it is this particular concept of paddhati that actually forced me in that sense to pick up history and look at it. But before I start, I do want to mention that I bow my head down to Dharampal ji, who has influenced so many thousands of people over many generations to make them see that a perspective that is rooted in the Indian experience is actually valid and it is doable. And it is with that confidence that someone like me, who also had an opportunity to stay with him, listen to him, and so on, I resolved that at some point I have to use my insights from practice in order to say a few things about how history approaches Indian arts and crafts, at least to problematize, if not suggest solutions. I think that is a first step. So, as you see, the very title has a few key words: Paddhati, tradition as archive and practice. And I've used both the word Paddhati and tradition. Right at the outset, I want to say that I have not used tradition as a translation for Paddhati. I've put it there because it's a commonly known word, and it is something that most of us sort of very instinctively use when we think of Indian arts and crafts, which have come from a past period. Tradition and traditional, very easily we sort of, it rolls off our tongue. But today I really do want to, argue that we have to possibly reconsider using words like tradition and replace them with words like Paddhati, and for a very specific reason. And this is what my presentation is going to be. So perhaps in 21st century too, as late as now today, if we look at the world, I think India has possibly, and I can say this quite confidently, the most diverse palette of musical forms, genres, musical styles, musical subforms, sub-styles, sub-genres, which are still sort of evolving and so on. So not only do we have a very expansive, diverse palette of musical forms, but we also have a great amount of layering of forms. We have a great amount of depth in each of them, the way they have been built over several centuries. So, I mean, to sort of illustrate, the point, for modern Indians, we may actually only look at music as a performative thing, where somebody is sitting on a stage and singing, or singing out of a technology device, and then you are simply an audience to it. Sometimes you may hum along with it, but music in India has several locations. Music was part of how the ancient people of this culture wondered at the universe and the creation and existence, right from the Samaveda. It is how they express their ideas on metaphysics, their love, their immersion with their experience of the divine, their experience of mundane work. It is the sound of their own singing voices that Indians worked to, and they still do in large parts of India. And they celebrate festivals with music. Music is part of celebrations in the family, the birth of a child, and even death. It also can be said that music, especially musicians, represented the power of kingdoms. Musicians accompanied soldiers into wars, but certainly also they carried histories and genealogies in musical form of jatis and kulas all across India, and we still have vestiges of these singing communities in many states like Bengal and Orissa and Telangana and parts of Gujarat and Rajasthan, and I think even parts of Maharashtra. And most of all, it is in the form of nada, from where the entire universe emanates for us. This nada is the form in which we worship the Brahman, or we visualize the Brahman as Nada Brahma. So this is the sort of very short, description that I can give of the various ways in which music is a part of our lives. However, it's an interesting thing to note, and I mean, I've noted this, and I've sort of also tried to correct myself, but I'm not able to. Increasingly in the 21st century, with this kind of experience, urban educated people like us, the more that technology mediated music reaches, I mean, Indian music reaches the rest of the world through recordings, through YouTube, and so many other media platforms that we have, the less and less we hear our own singing voices. So somewhere the practice and the experience of singing is being alienated from our minds and our bodies. So this is something that I have noted as a teacher of music, and this is something that I've also noted as a researcher. And hence, with the proliferation of more and more music, we are actually moving further and further away from some very basic concepts in traditional Indian music that for centuries we have managed to not lose. So at this point, I think one can stop and try to sort of go back and see how are we going to understand Indian music? So, as I already mentioned, tradition is inadequate. It simplifies what the action of maintaining continuities and making these musical forms, these art forms relevant today. It sort of simplifies the whole process, that collection of actions. But it also carries a baggage from the Western perspective, which in some ways guides and pushes at us into thinking of these practices in a certain way. One of the things we may, know, I mean, many of us are scholars here. I assume that we know that, in the West, there is a certain idea of time, progress, and change. So the idea of tradition also has been theorized to align with that idea of progress, which is to absolutely move from one place to another. Within the Indian understanding, that's not the way we understand, that's not the way we approach change. For the practitioner of Indian music or any traditional Indian art or craft form, uh, a necessary evolution would be how much better can you visualize the ideal form. Have I moved from visualizing it in a certain way yesterday to visualizing it better and giving it a better form today? So that is our definition of progress. And hence, to leave behind what we do and do something new has never been the way in India for any art form in that sense. So, but some of the misconceptions when we use the word tradition comes from the Western perspective, from that formulation, which is natural for them, it is just unnatural for us, that's all. Is that then tradition is a word that is used to refer to things that are necessarily fixed, or a large part of it is fixed in the past, and never do we ever discuss the idea of creative transformation and change being a necessary part of tradition. Because simply put, if a tradition is not alive, then it's a museum piece, it's an artifact. If something is alive, then it has arrived here through a continuous process of change. So this is simply my suggestion, and then we will see how it works through the rest of my thing. I would rather use words in Indian languages that you can associate with tradition. So Paddhati is what I choose to hold as the central concept, a sort of a framework within which to understand how we have been producing musical forms for such long centuries, how we diversify, how we transform, how we improvise, and so on and so forth. But there are other associated words like Parampara, Rudi, and in Tamil we have a word called Vali, which simply means the way. And there are many more words in Indian languages which actually add a lot more grain and texture to the act of maintaining and practicing continuities. Now, modern history, historical methodology, since it struggles to sort of include these kinds of definitions within it, the proposal is that we use frameworks like Paddhati to examine, how evolution takes place in within Indian music, and how we can better describe this phenomenon called Indian music. Now, there may be a question: is there even something like a composite Indian music? Can one say it? My quick answer is an emphatic yes, because right now we have very many ways in which we describe music, which is, we say classical music, we say folk music, devotional music, and so on, and work music and so on. But what is really, quickly, if you look at all of these things, this thing of a continuous stream to the past, which is which is diligently maintained by the practitioners, and this sort of push towards the future so that it may stay relevant. These are two things that all these forms of music will exhibit. So that is the reason why, I think within this Indic perspective, one can pick concepts like Paddhati to actually pay more attention to them, and try to try to use these frameworks in order to understand practice. So I say Indian historicity for just making it simple. How do we? The question is, see, there is a word called archive in the title. So, but I don't want to dwell too much on the word called archive, because then I'll have to problematize it outside of history and inside history. So I'll just leave it there for now. But basically, the idea is to ask, how do we remember the nuances, the details, the structures, the techniques, and the purposes of uh, practices like musical forms. So very quickly, when we ask questions like who sang, where did they sing, when did they sing, and so on, it never is in the absence of the question, how did they do it? So there is this great allegation against India that we tend to be very ahistorical. We don't have a sense of history and so on. But the point is, this is what practitioners, or this is what critical thinkers in India have done. They have pushed the question of how do you do it ahead of who did it. This is a larger discussion on whether it was right to do so, wrong to do so, and so on. But this you actually see, if you observe, you see in so many different practices, whether it's more so in craft traditions, and less so now in art traditions, which are which are more urban, which are more text and writing based traditions. You do see you do see some ownership, but largely we concentrated on the how. So if we perhaps want to build an integrated perspective on Indian music, to tell the story of Indian music, then we are going to have to go beyond history. And so then my suggestion is that within history, I like to examine this idea of Paddhati. So Paddhati, in short, Padhati, that is, you make a mark, you make a stroke of the foot confidently, so others may follow you. So one can interpret it in so many different ways, but simply put, that every generation, every group of practitioners, based on the strong and very strong backing of generations of intuition and experience and study and improvisation and experimentation, they create a set of experiences, and then for the next set of practitioners to come and actually follow it and look at it critically, change some, not change some, and so on. A very important part of remembering is also forgetting, because sometimes some things may not work, so some aspects are left behind, and so on. So what does the framework of Paddhati involve? Paddhati includes teaching, it includes practice and performance in the case of performing arts, of course. Otherwise, you could say production. It involves deep contemplation on how we have brought learning of rules and so on, along with our experimentation, our performance, and the practice, and then finally through the contemplation to actually contribute something original through the creative transformation, the idea of an alapa. So some forms pick some of these things. They do some of these things more predominantly than others. So we can look at those forms a little later. How do they do these things? They use some forms use Shastra, which are canons and rules and so on. Most forms, all forms actually, heavily depend on the observed phenomena, which is to learn it from a guru, to learn it from a community and so on, or a family and so on. And Paddhati also includes a very important ingredient, which is social feedback. It's never done in isolation from society. And so, where are these insights sourced from? So, either treatises and texts in the case of Shastra, the practitioner's experience in all the cases, and from contemporary critical analysis. I call it critical analysis because something like a society accepting an alapa, an improvisation, is not an easy process. So that is why I call it critical analysis and contemporary critical analysis by a large community of people. So they may be co-practitioners, they may be people who are your patrons, audiences, or anyone. And why is all this done? What is the purpose that Paddhati as a framework is seen to be important? Because for Indian art forms, the journey is from Uddeshya to Auchitya. These are two very useful words for us. I remember Ankur asking me in the first discussion, what is the underlying tattva of art practice? And I realized that I cannot speak on tattva unless I speak on Paddhati, because it is only within the framework of a Paddhati of bringing all these factors and tying them together that we can make the journey from Uddeshya, or the very purpose for which we sing, to Auchitya, which is making the proper form, or producing a perfect song, or sort of getting lost in the perfect alapa, or evoking the bhava in most number of people who surround you, and so on. So whatever the purpose is, to achieve it by creating the perfect form, this is the journey for the art form. And this entire journey, the Paddhati is supposed to take charge of. So a little bit on the mechanics of I mean, what does it really involve, and where do we see it? I mean, when you hear a song, when you see a practitioner singing, do you know if this is being done according to a Paddhati or not? So there are some little things that if you can watch out for, that Paddhati basically reaches out to two things. One is technique and the other is identity. So if there is sort of a very loose, disproportionate nature, characteristic to a rendition or a form, and you cannot recognize that there is a technique, a recognizable technique, then you don't know. You may question. You can ask, what is this Paddhati? What is the lineage? What is the genealogy? So there is a genealogy to the technique, and there is a lineage in the identity. Often the genealogies of the technique are maintained by the lineages of practitioners. So they may either be a jati, they may be a gurukula, they may be even institutions. There are great institutions which have now become you can recognize them as practicing a certain kind of technique. So technique transfers some validation to the identity, and then you can name them something like a gharana, or a bani, or some name. I mean, in for instance, in handloom weaving, you will know a particular technique by the name of the place. So you say a Maheshwari, a Banarasi, a Mangalagiri, and so on. In a gharana, you will have Kirana or Jaipur Atroli or something. And in a bani, which is what Carnatic musicians use, you will go by the name of your guru. And so these two things are, they are mutually negotiating all the time. um, so coming back, actually I already mentioned this. So why do we use these terms like classical and folk and so on? Because they really don't tell us the story about either about the practitioners and what they have done, or about the place where these things can be traced back to. So for instance, there is a problem in calling something classical, or shastriya, for instance, because in most cases, the students of a shastriya form come into studying the theoretical basis of what they are doing much after they have mastered the physical act of singing or playing an instrument. So it is as much an embodied form than it is just based on classical. Because, and in many cases, classical forms just come down the guru shishya parampara. Students follow what their gurus say, and the technique passes on to the identity, and the identity to the technique, and then it keeps rolling down. But these are sort of momentarily, you fix some name, so you may be able to share it with somebody as a sort of, this is just language, that's it has nothing to do with the form, essentially. um, when you have a great diversity like this, then there is also a problem of, you expect that they will all sort of form like Darwin's theory of evolution, that one will come from the other and the other will come, it will just flow down. So there are lots of controversies, lots of sort of discussions where people ask which came first, the folk or the classical. Did classical come from folk, or folk came from classical? So these are questions that cannot be answered because the questions are wrong, not because answers can't be found. I mean, if you beat the question enough, it will give you an answer, but that is not the purpose of this thing. So different musical forms have taken different routes to the present time. Their origins may be very closely linked. So I will play a little recording here of Yakshagana music from Kasargod by Sri Ravi Shankara, who very kindly actually recorded this for me a few days ago. Today, all my recordings are in the raga Mohanam or Bhoop, just so that we can keep that melodic structure in mind. The reason why I'm playing this is 300 years ago. So the Yakshagana is a Nataka, is basically from Karnataka, in the area of Kasargod has a great number of practitioners of Yakshagana. But as a theatre form, it goes all the way back to centuries of our traditions in theatre, so in the south especially. So in Tanjavur, 300 years ago, when the Maratha rulers were there, they actually composed a huge number of natakas, drishya natakas and gaya natakas, that are musical plays and visual plays that were enacted too. And what I wanted to show you was, this is a repertoire of this particular Yakshagana musician from today, which has come through the Karna Parampara, or the sort of inelegant translation of Karna Parampara is oral tradition. But any parampara cannot just be given to another person by saying it. The other person has to actually listen. So if you say it is a Karna Parampara, it's implicit that somebody has said it to you. But if you just call it an oral tradition, you don't know, and there is no guarantee that somebody actually listened to you. So we'd like to call it the Karna Parampara. The other piece which I will sing and show you is actually from a notation of a 300-year-old Nataka composed by Maharaja Shahaji of Tanjavur. And you will see that there are very many similarities in these two forms. One that has come down the Karna Parampara, and one that has been archived, put as a manuscript in a library, picked up, and with the help of practitioners, it has been notated, and then it has been reinterpreted. So the other tune has come down in many iterations. We'll discuss that after we hear this. I hope this recording plays.
ಉದಯ ಕಾಲದೊಳೆತ್ತು ಕಂಸನಿತರು ಕರನ ಉದಯ ಕಾಲದೊಳೆತ್ತು ಕಂಸನಿತರು ಕರನ ಹರನ ಪದ ಪೂಜಿಸಿ ಊಟ ಒದಗಿ ಮಾಡಿದನು ಹರನ ಪದಮ ಪೂಜಿಸಿ ಊಟ ಒದಗಿ ಮಾಡಿದನು.
So now I will sing for you that little piece from 300 years ago that has come in a very staggered way to the 21st century. It sounds almost like this because in the same raga, but I mean, if you can see the differences. Yetularam mandunoyamma indudharuni yetularam mandunoyamma నిటలనే త్రుడు నేడు నిడు కొలువయునాడు ఎటులరం మందును యమ్మా. It's just two lines from an operatic theatre where there is a conversation going on between Parvati and her friends on what is the best way to distract Shiva and meet him. So all these natakas generally were around Puranic subjects and so on. But Yakshagana sort of went to Tanjavur in sort of central Tamil Nadu along with the Vijayanagara rulers. It stayed there for a while until the Marathas were there, and then it sort of shifted back to Karnataka towards the end of that. But the theatre tradition sort of mutually influenced each other. The Maratha rulers of Tanjavur also composed in Telugu, which was the classical language of the Tamil speaking state in Tanjavur, because previously the Vijayanagara rulers had been there. So you see, there's 300 years ago, that place is just like a cauldron. It's like it's boiling with all manners of influences. There is also Kirtan tradition that is coming in, and it's getting influenced by many other things, and it's going back to Maharashtra. The Nataka is going back to Maharashtra. The Yakshagana comes and it leaves. So it leaves something and then it takes something. After that, for about 200 years or maybe 150 years, they grow in very isolated ways by themselves. The Yakshagana lived, but the Nataka in the Prabandha, as this is called, in Tanjavur, did not find many takers. But instead what happened was the great music of all this influenced what later became Carnatic music, which is actually in sort of its named form as Carnatic is very recent. It's still evolving into something that is what we call more Shastra Sangeeta. But then how do we write a history of all this without understanding what each of these lineages, how they actually pushed their genealogies of techniques forward? How did they adapt to their new social locations, knowledge locations, to their new patrons and so on? And how elsewhere it went into the archive. Also political things, because when 1947 the Devadasi Act came, the Devadasis, who were the sole musicians who sang these natakas, could not sing them any longer. Whereas Yakshagana was performed by male musicians, and they continued their practice. So there are so many factors that come into influencing genealogies and lineages, and unless we understand how lineages work and how genealogies work, how Paddhati works, we won't be able to write a true account of Indian music. So I thought it would be interesting to frame Paddhati as something that moves between these two poles of Uddeshya and Auchitya, of the purpose of each art form to to the final finished product, which we all want to be a perfect product. Um, so here is where this very um, popular concept of rasa and bhava come into play. There is a recognition within each paddhati about what its purpose is. So there are some paddhatis, like what we call classical music today, where some of the schools, some of the banis, some gharanas are very interested in an exposition of the Shastra. That is their purpose. If that is the stated purpose, then what they do with their vocal techniques or their instrumental techniques, how they build their instruments, what kind of audiences they sing to, how far they will be willing to negotiate, for the sake of creating a bhava, this negotiation between the intellectual and the emotional, how far they'd be, willing to do. All these things then get determined by what they want to achieve. So people who are leaning more towards Shastra, you will notice that in their, vocal techniques, in their vocal practices, you will notice some things. This of course is a deep delve into a certain musical form, but there are certain other musical forms like, the Jati singers. So there are very few communities in India left where music happens as part of Jati Vritti. So I did some work in Rajasthan with the Manganiyar and Langa musicians whose patrons are the Rajputs and the Sindhi Sipahis. And it was, a most revealing experience for me because they do not sing to an audience. They sing to patrons. And the patrons have or judgmans as they call them. So this is part of the older judgmani system. The patrons do not appreciate, of course they appreciate the melodic prowess, the talent and so on of particular musicians. However, they own the music. So when you have sitting in front of you judgmans who are not there frivolously just to sort of see how you're doing or to be entertained by you, but who are there because you are an integral part of everything that happens in their life, that music sounds different. So an a Dutch ethnomusicologist, Boer Joep, in his very beautiful work on the Manganiyars, in one place says that the musicians used to accompany the soldiers to war and they would sing these songs of valor. And sometimes the younger soldiers, they're all waiting. The war has not been announced. The battle has not started yet, but sort of riled up by the music, they would charge ahead of everybody even before anything has started. And often some of them would even get killed because, they didn't follow the rule of the start of the war. So these musicians would go to war with their soldiers. They would be there at every occasion of their judgman's life, and the judgman in return sort of looked after the lives of the musicians. How would that music, that is the purpose of that music, so it is filled with a certain kind of bhava and emotion. So I want to play a little piece by these extraordinary musicians, Alauddin and Shumar Khan. So this is from Marwad, the Marwad region of Rajasthan, and these are this Alauddin and Sumar Khan were from the Langa community, and these are musicians that were literally discovered for the world by Sri Komal Kothari of Rupa and Sanstha. And, I sort of went to their archives, and it was amazing to actually be able to hear these musicians. They're no longer there with us. I played this particular piece because Drupad also comes, one great lineage of Drupad, the Dagars come from that same region. And now this Langa music is officially classified as folk music. So if you go to the All India Radio, they sing as folk musicians. And this year, the Manganear musician Lakha Kanji got the Padma Shri and under the category of folk music. But the great scholar Mukund Lat ji, who was in Jaipur, who's also not with us any longer, he actually calls this music Raga Sangita, because there are there are parts of this music that is alapa, that is improvisational, and this piece actually has those little endings of notes. Extraordinary work, extraordinarily vocal expressions. So in the neighborhood is this great lineage of Drupad. So I'll play something, and I'm going to play 3 pieces of music here, and then we'll see how difficult it becomes to imagine these categories. I want to play the next piece from Carnatic music. That was Pandit Uday Bhavakar, who is a great Drupad exponent of current times, who lives in Pune. What I want to project here for discussion is that there are no regional specificities here. The first 2 recordings are from Rajasthan, very close to each other. The third recording is, nearly 1,000 kilometers south from Tamil Nadu by, a great musician of yesteryears, Vidwan K.V. Narayanaswamy. Both of them are singing a kind of alapa, a kind of improvisatory music, which in Carnatic is called Tanam, Ragam Tanam, and in Drupad, it's part of the Jod Jhala. And I think it's called Nomtom. In Carnatic, we would call it Tanam, and we would use the word Anantam or Ananta to build these phrasal improvisations. So in Paddhatis, you will hear Langa musicians pushing at the boundaries of fixed repertoires to bring in improvisation. In Paddhatis like Dhrupad and Carnatic music, which have had long centuries to sort of do this kind of creative transformative practice, you would see that, they have a much larger structure within which they can bring newer and newer ideas. But today, if you look at Manganiyar musicians and Langa musicians, there again you start immediately seeing that those lineages that believe in different genealogies of techniques go in different directions. Some people move towards what we call Khayal Sangeet, some people move towards Sufi music, and some people, of course, are happy to go to Bollywood and so on. So, you actually see that experiment going on right now in Rajasthan. So it's extremely fascinating. I just have 2 slides. I'll quickly go through them, and then maybe we can address some of the things in the question answers. Is that a very important part of what we see as what is beautiful in music is the idea of Sahridaya. So every musical form has around it a community of people that forms that Sahridaya, which is a group of people. It's not based on knowing something. This is not about knowing techniques, having knowledge about the form, or or so on. It's about identifying with what that form is supposed to do. It is about identifying with the purpose of that form. So I had a very interesting conversation with a Manganiyar musician, Lakha Kanji, who said, I asked him about a very, very old repertoire, and he says, we don't sing it any longer. And his explanation was it's sung only in big weddings, and weddings are getting broken. The people are breaking their marriages, so he no longer thinks he should sing that. So Sahridaya is that there is a musical form which for him is integrally connected with the value of marriage in this case. It could be anything else, but in this case it's marriage. So for him it is inseparable. So this Sahridaya takes expression in the Jajmani system. It takes expression in simply a patron saying, here is my gold chain. You did an excellent job. But among the Manganiyars, they take it a step forward, which is they play games with raga systems, because they have 6 ragas, each for each direction. So, they hide things and have the musician give them clues. So they are so tuned into the modes, into the melodic structure of the music, that they can use the music as a map. So music maps onto so many things because of this idea of Sahridaya, and Paddhatis, or systems of techniques are very aware that this is the purpose. The purpose is to create that Sahridaya. And as I mentioned, that once the Sahridaya is created, then everybody actually has a shared idea of what the value of that music is to be. So the Sahridaya Drupadiyas, which means not just the musicians, but everybody around them who share that identification, knows what is a great piece of Drupad music because of what it's supposed to do, which in the case of Drupad, or in the case of Carnatic music, there's this great element of bhakti. So you have to sort of evoke that, the bhava, where you are able to visualize a Rama, or you're able to, lose yourself in the idea of, a Devi and so on. In Drupad, it may be more directly to do with the sound and with the breathing and so on. So the purpose of the Paddhati, which says that your change, your improvisation, everything has to be anchored in what we already know, in things that already work, is because the purpose of the whole art form is to create that perfect ideal form, which serves their purpose. So how is it? What are the things that Paddhati does? Of course, it is the thing of transmission. I'll quickly go to the next slide. So Sadrishya Pramana, of course, is a very complex idea, so I will not elaborate on that. So the archival part of Paddhati, which is how you remember something, how you interpret something, and how you, along with Kala, how as Sahridayas, as audiences, as patrons, and as musicians, you move forward to the next thing, aligning with time, aligning with the changes that time brings in. That part is defined under Sahridaya. How techniques are remembered, how forms, the Swarupa, for instance, is remembered, and how you give material to that visualization, and all of that comes under Sadrishya Pramana, which again deals with the perfect proportion. How do you make something of perfect proportion? That's it, simply put. That's, I mean, it's a more simplistic way of describing an extremely complex process, but that's what it is. So there it is. It's this Paddhati pushes forward on the strength of what we call Parampara. So there are Guru Paramparas, there are Sishya Paramparas, there are Shastra Paramparas, and of course there is the great Karna Parampara, which I actually like very much because I think it is very central to a lot of what has happened in Indian music. So the Guru Sishya Paddhati, I want to say this before I end, is that often people think that Guru Sishya Paddhati is about teaching techniques in music, but it is an entire system of ethics which are taught, because techniques cannot be built in isolation. It comes from deep within you to have a commitment to craft your body and to give it time and to do all of that. And hence the ethics that are required to become a certain kind of musician transfers onto life. So the guru actually transfers or transmits an entire set of ethics to the student, and sometimes it's not even said in words. It is just simply imbibed by being in the atmosphere. And this is how many of these musicians like Langas and Manganyars, this is how they learn music. There is no teaching until they are ready to perform. The children just are there and they pick it up. That's more like it. And of course, Samajikata, which was there in the previous slide, is a very, very important part of how carefully and how diligently you build a practice, because without social patronage, there is nothing. And hence, the Jajmani Paddhati of the past was very crucial. It has been until 20th century. It has been sort of the axis, the more central core thing that has supported what we call this great Paddhati and Sampradaya and so on. Without the Jajmani system being there, this would not have been possible. I just wanted to discuss this idea of creative transformation, how Paddhati musicians use it as a very, very safe space to do their experiments. And there is an example here, which later on maybe I'll explain how it was done. But to assume that traditions don't change is to leave out half of the story. And so actually it's only about how transformations are brought in and how standardizations are brought in and so on. and how then that gets instituted as the Paddhati, and then how that will move on again in maybe a century, sometimes in half a century. And so with examples we can understand all of these things.
So my first two questions are actually interrelated. Um, so because you talked about Paddhati and about the way in which it unites different forms of Indian music. One question which I have is that we see there are different kinds of practices, and there's often a talk about synthesis, and especially when it comes to forms like Qawwali and Khayal and all. And how do you then identify a sort of an Indian essence in all of these different forms of music, which is also connected to the next question, that in literature, in the Kavya Shastra, the great marker of a great literature is considered to be Ras, Dhwani, and Auchitya. And so, do we have something like, I mean, Paddhati is one example in music, which can be considered as an essential marker, which can also then relate to my first question, that how do you then, identify the essence of Indian music? So,
yeah. No, this is a very important question, and I missed out on this. Of course, it's such an expansive topic. The idea of dhwani and rasa, these are very central to what practitioners do. As I said, if the Uddeshya is bhakti, for instance, let us just assume it's bhakti. So I was listening to one of these what do you call them? Not kirtankars, but modern day kirtankars from the south who are part of this Vithala Sampradaya, but from Chennai and around there. So I was listening to them, and one of his songs was totally folk. It was from the Terkuttu tradition, and then one song was totally abhang, and then there were nirupanas from Bhajana Sampradaya and so on. So there I realized he has to do what he has to do in order for the people around him to have a vision of Vitthala. That he will do. What do you call this? This entire thing is called Dhwani. No? Anandavardhana's, Dhwanyaloka, and I think Abhinav Gupta is the one who suggests this idea of resonance.
Right. The whole rasa theory, and yeah.
This whole the idea that something goes around, the resonance.
That is the experience, the anubhuti in the
anubhuti, but it goes around and it comes back as a feedback to the musician also.
Okay.
He sings that folk tune. Why is he singing it? Because it's worked. He has seen somebody in front of him with tears in his eyes. He has seen somebody scream, "Oh Vitthala," or something like that. That, I take this example because it's fresh in my mind. I was very amused that the span of styles that he had included, and it's very similar with the Manganiyars also. Now they are called, so the Manganiyar musicians, funnily enough, were Jati musicians. Now they are called Sufi musicians.
Okay.
In their modern form, when they travel all across India, it's called Sufi music, and they sing a lot of Qawwalis, and they sing a lot of Sindhi songs, and Damadam Mast Kalandar is one such song. But traditionally their songs were about the Rajputs going to war or getting married or going on a horse. Very majestic songs. But they are able to do that today because they have the confidence that is the resonating Sahridaya that they are singing to and singing with. That's why the idea of Sahridaya is very important. Right.
So can we say that Sahridaya is like one sort of identifier and one sort of marker which really characterizes Indian music and different.
Yeah, but there has to be critical numbers also. You can't say two people said so, I changed my style. It won't pay.
Okay.
Patronage is a very good marker.
Right.
Whether you are able to have, if you can, as one Carnatic musician said, if I can pay my EMI, I'm good, he said.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very interesting that how there are so many different forms of And when you talked about Paddhati also, you explained that in very different ways. Like it also consists of so many different things, like how it is transmitted and how it is performed, how it is interpreted. So is that similar across like all the various musical forms, or is it like it varies? I mean, how
So yes,
it is
if
interpreted? I mean, how do you
something,
define Paddhati in terms of like, is there like a very universal definition of Paddhati as such? Like,
yeah, basically I look for, first of all, I look whether a Paddhati contributes to a technical standardization, and
mhm.
whether it has a name, an identity.
Okay, okay.
Ah, So you have recognizably something called Kawali,
Hmm.
which you can call Kawali.
Yeah, right, right,
That's
right,
like a Paddhati.
right, right.
Right? You have recognizably something called, um, uh, you know, anything. I mean, baul music.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you can call it baul music. So if you have a baul a musician calling it something else, then you
Hmm.
have to examine it. Then you become curious about what's happening there.
Hmm. But do they all, like whether it is bowls or whether it is kawalis, do they all then self-consciously, all of them have the same Paddhati, as in Sahadya is definitely like a conscious attempt in all of them?
Yes, if they want to be baul singers, they have to intimately know who they are singing for.
Right, 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 right. Yeah.
They are co-singers. People sitting in front of them, behind them, by them. They have to know them.
Okay. Yeah. Right, 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 right. Yeah. That's very important, I would say. And another question which I had was regarding, I mean, different, practices like in arts also. We have different kinds of markers for good art, and I mean, and also the fact that I mean, since you are creating an archive of Anand Kumaraswamy, and I've read some of his works, and he's very particular about the fact that he says that there is no such thing as there's no difference between as in a productive or a utilitarian art and a beautiful art, because something that is beautiful will always be utilitarian, and it's not. So do you also see the same thing in music? Like, because and the reason I'm asking this question is like we see a sort of very trash Bollywood music, so to say, and I don't know if I can call it utilitarian because it serves some purpose maybe for some people, and uh, or is there like beautiful music which serves everybody? I mean, like how do you then
So, see, I think at every point in time in history, people have asked the same question. Because every time something new comes,
yeah.
that idea of Sahridaya gets rattled a little bit.
Okay, okay,
And then what happens is some people are being pulled away from identifying with you to identifying with something else.
okay, okay.
So, utility in that sense, the way Kumaraswamy speaks about,
Hmm.
that he does not think that anything is, in Indian art, anything is made purely for your enjoyment.
Hmm.
Because eternal bliss, that Sachidananda for him is the only definition of joy,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is in line with what the ascetics and the yogis and the philosophers of the Indian tradition say anyway.
Right,
So
right, right.
if you put him alongside them,
Hmm.
then Bollywood, of course, is an extremely momentary form of joy,
Hmm.
and hence that is hardly anything for him.
Right, 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 right.
When you have a dinosaur level of joy, this is like a mosquito. So I don't think it even counts.
Hmm.
For us, it's such a big phenomenon that it's in our face, so we have to pay attention to it.
Hmm.
But if you are a person that is aligned with the ideas of, say, someone like Kumaraswamy, then you have to go beyond that into what mysticism says. Then
Right.
he says every art is either serving a ritual purpose or a mystical purpose, or then a mundane purpose also.
Hmm.
So in that sense, actually, he has a essay on carpentry, which is very interesting.
Okay.
Some point we will look at it.
Okay. So you're saying that music also in that sense like has the same ideal of Satchidanand, and then that is the ultimate, ideal. And I mean, I like the way that you explained that it's the ideal that we are always
I
trying.
want to make one small interjection. We
Hmm.
should not understand any of this in terms of religion,
Hmm.
because I have actually sat in a village of tribal, in a tribal village in Telangana,
Hmm.
and when they all start singing, that is very ecstatic,
Hmm.
and that actually was the beginning of my idea that we are losing our singing voices, that we don't sing like them. Every person in the village sings, every person in that village dances. We have lost that capacity.
Right.
We have lost a way for Sachidananda. We've become very intellectual in that sense.
Right.
That's why I'm saying we should keep that, the ecstasy part, mysticism part away from religion.